Michael Cohen might not have been the only insider taping conversations with President Trump. Multiple people tell the Daily Beast that former Apprentice star and presidential aide Omarosa rolled on some conversations with the president and used them to shop around her soon-to-be-released book, Unhinged. So yet another dramatic betrayal by a one-time confidant. The president, of course, suggesting without proof that he was actually the one taped by Barack Obama and James Comey. Let's not forget that. Daily Beast reporter Lachlan Markay, who broke the story, joins us now. My panel is here as well. So, Lachlan, what did your sources tell you about these supposed recordings?
Well, we spoke to three sources, one of whom actually heard one of these recordings, and two of them had the contents described to them. And they all described them as probably not as incriminating as the recordings that Michael Cohen made of the president. But I think it does point to a major breakdown in trust between the president and someone who was very close to him for well over a decade through his career in reality TV and into the White House, who really tells everyone who will listen how much the president trusts her, and has now decided to sort of cash in on her time in the White House, break with the president in a very big way, and obviously recording him without his knowledge would be, an extremely significant breach of that trust.
Look, we don't want to project what might be on these tapes or how many they are, but would it be fair to say, Lachlan, that what your sources heard may not or probably are not all the tapes that exist, and if she used them to shop the book, there's something on there, I'm not saying that's criminal, but at least it's going to sell books?
I think it's certainly possible that there are more recordings. We reached out to Simon & Schuster, the publisher of her forthcoming book, who essentially said they wouldn't confirm or deny that she had recorded these conversations, but they said, we are confident that there is documentation or enough evidence to back up every claim that Omarosa is making in this book. So, now, obviously, they want to avoid a situation that resulted from, say, Michael Wolff's Fire and Fury book, where there was a lot of disputed information. But that suggested to me, at least, that there could be additional information up in there that is backed up by recordings. And if and when the White House attempts to challenge potentially some of the more damaging information in this book, that could be an occasion where they come forward with documentation or even a recording to show that what she's saying is accurate.
So, A.B., does this bring to mind the old phrase, with friends like this, who needs enemies?
No, I think it brings to mind the phrase, if you mess with the bull, you get the horns, because President Trump knew exactly what he was getting by making Omarosa a West Wing advisor. She has a reputation of using any means to put herself first. She stabs in the back, she stabs in the front, and it's not a problem. It's really sport. So I don't know what the tapes are going to reveal, but the fact is he gave her this privilege and access, and he knows her. He knew her reputation, not only behind closed doors, but I guess on The Apprentice, where this was her character. And I'm just not at all surprised. It's
and apparently
a chance he
continues to play it well, right? I mean, if the tapes exist, and it sounds like these tapes exist, Ben, I mean, what does it say about life inside the West Wing? Is everybody got to be looking over their shoulder because who knows what's on tape?
Of course they do. I mean, we all know that this is an incredibly backbiting, infighting White House in which everybody is leaking about everybody else and out for their own agenda. And A.B. is exactly right. What did you expect when you hired Omarosa for the White House? Like, I'm thinking about this and thinking about myself 5 years ago. If you told me I'd be on television talking about Omarosa taping President Trump in the White House, I would have laughed at you. I would have, I would never have believed that we'd be talking about this. But of course you hire her. Of course she's in it for herself, in it to make some money down the road. And one way to do that is have tapes. And who knows what President Trump says on these tapes? Probably nothing terribly embarrassing. But this is a White House filled with people who are constantly looking over their shoulders, constantly worried about who's leaking. It comes as absolutely no surprise to anybody on earth that Omarosa taped the president.
Lachlan, I want to read an excerpt from a page that you got from Omarosa's yet-to-be-released book about a hunt for leakers inside the White House. And this is what Omarosa writes. Very low-key, Ivanka Trump went around to the original Trumpers, the loyal soldiers, and asked the team to compile a list of suspected leakers. I'd already said my piece about Katie Walsh directly to Donald, and she'd been let go. But Ivanka wanted a new list, and once she had it, she would give it to Scaramucci so he could fire them all. The final list that was texted to me on July 22nd had 10 names on it. So now we have a hit list, right?
Yeah, and there were some names that a lot of viewers will know on there. Folks like Raj Shah, the deputy press secretary, Michael Short, who was a press aide who came in with sort of the RNC crew in the early days of the White House.
Was Donald Trump on the list of leakers?
He is not. I don't think Scaramucci was going to march into the Oval and try to fire him. But, it does go to the issue of sort of trust and a lot of this backbiting that Ben was talking about from the very early days of the White House. And I think it speaks to why someone would end up taping conversations with the president. There's just this immense lack of trust between colleagues in the White House, up to and including the president. And it's very hard to form a coherent policy agenda or a coherent messaging strategy when you don't trust the person sitting next to you and you're constantly looking over your shoulder, worried that the next person is going to be leaking or accusing you of leaking. That was a very common way of sort of undercutting rivals in the White House. So, I think it speaks to the sort of larger dysfunction that Americans see on a day-to-day basis. A lot of that is personnel issues and people simply not trusting the person sitting next to them.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.